apparently gave him anything like a Miranda warning. Anything he says can and will be used against him in a court of law. Well, U.S. Senator Amy Klobuchar is a Democrat from Minnesota and an attorney, and she joins us now. Senator, a couple points. The consequence of legal decisions. If the court rules the president's beyond his bounds, and this does involve an Establishment Clause violation because it does involve singling out a religion for a ban on travel, where does that lead us that says Trump's wrong? But then who does set the policy on illegal or dangerous immigrants coming into this country? Who is responsible, the courts or the president? Subsequent to a decision, doesn't it go back to him?
The president is responsible for national security, Chris. I think you've articulated that well, but there are three equal branches of government, and Congress in many ways gets involved as well. So if this were to happen, I think the administration needs to look at what are the biometrics and technology they want to add. Do they want to add more vetting? Obviously, we've really upgraded the vetting over the years for these refugees. And by the way, it's not just the 7 countries for the refugees. It's from everywhere in the world. We have a 4-year-old toddler that we were finally able to get through since the order. So if this happens, then he simply will have to do what I think he should have done in the first place, is work with people, figure out what he wants to add with vetting. If he has actual threats of people from these countries and he wants to change some things and do some things good. But I think what happened here is this was so rashly drafted that, in fact, the next day they came in and said, oh, it doesn't include green card people. Well, I'm glad that they did that, but that actually became one of the arguments here. You can't just change what the order meant originally, and it just shows how many difficulties there are with this order under the law.
Okay, let's talk about the fact, let's talk about two options here. If the Ninth Circuit, which is the most liberal court in the country on every cultural or political issue that I can think of, it's a liberal circuit court, and this administration is very unlucky to have found itself in that court, but they're in there and they're going to rule on this appeal. My question is, if they go with the government on this, they go with the Justice Department on this, and they basically end the ban, you're coming out of Washington State, Minnesota. What will you think of that? Will you think that was a mistake by the court? Will you think it's something that has to be remedied some other way? Or will you say, presidents probably have to make these big decisions. That's why we have elections. How will you react to it as a lawmaker?
Well, I would like to see it. Obviously, I'd like to see it go the other way. Okay. If it goes the other way, two things. Number one, I would like to get the administration to simply admit that this has not worked. As Rob Portman, senator, said, the vetting rule wasn't vetted. There are children, there are people that are caught in transit, and they need to fix it. Secondly, the Congress, we do have a bill, and right now it is a Democratic bill, but to repeal the ban. And Congress should get involved. We have a duty here, I believe, to get involved and to work with the people in our states. So those are two ways to change this that don't involve the courts, but I think you're going to continue to see court cases and individual rights asserted because this is a constitutional issue as well as a security issue. I always believe the number one focus of government should be people's safety. But as you can see from the brief that was filed in this case, a number of national security experts, former CIA people, all said this actually doesn't make us safer because of the way it was done.
How do we predict where the next terrorist is going to come from? I mean, the attorneys go by precedent. Professor Coe talked about precedent. There's no example of these 7 countries yielding terror. But we know that Somalia is a dangerous country. We know it is. We know that Hezbollah is supported entirely by Iran. We know these groups are international. They're mobile. But they come from different countries. We know Saran, probably the first terrorist of the modern era, killed Bobby Kennedy. He came from Palestine. So he was Palestinian or Jordanian at the time. So I might just question is, how do you know? How do you know which country is going to hit us next?
Everything. You use every tool you can
for the vetting process. Call to figure out which. Isn't it the president's essential call? If this were Barack Obama, wouldn't you trust him to decide where our threats were coming from? If it were Obama,
but Barack Obama did upgrade the vetting process, and we have done a number of things with visas.
He focused on the travel dangers of those 7 countries, particularly. He focused on those 7 countries.
And the administration and the Congress have worked on this now to change our vetting process, acknowledging that there's a lot of really dangerous people out there that want to do us harm. But I don't believe that this means that we should throw out the entire refugee program, which is basically what this did for a period of time for any country in the world. I don't believe that this was the right way to go. Instead of working with people to see what changes the president wanted to make, instead they put in this complete ban, and they caused chaos throughout the world. And it's no surprise to me that they are now looking at trying to change it and saying, well, it doesn't interpret it to do this. We're going to use this exception for that. And instead, I think they're better off starting from scratch here, working with all of the law enforcement and agencies and General Kelly at Homeland Security, and that would be the smartest thing to do. But meanwhile, we'll wait to see what the court says.
I wish you well in terms of legislation, because I think that's always the better way. Legislation with the president, batting it out with him, figuring out some consensus way of going about it rationally rather than let Big Daddy court judge decide whether we're right or wrong. Thank you.
I can see you love lawyers, Chris.
No,
I can see you just love the law.
I'm with Scalia on one thing. I like laws, not interpretations.
And there's no better thing for you to cover than a 3-judge telephoned-in court hearing, but you've done it with much class.
They're very smart, these guys. Anyway, thank you very much, Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota. As this legal fight goes on, President Trump's also accusing the media, of course, as he always does, of intentionally downplaying terrorist threats. And this is what he told U.S. military personnel yesterday at Medill Air Force Base in Tampa.
It's gotten to a point where it's not even being reported. And in many cases, the very, very dishonest press doesn't want to report it. They have their reasons, and you understand that.
Well, that's absolute nonsense. The press covers every terrorist act it even hears about, but we can't take care of ones that didn't happen. That's a problem for us. I guess we don't know what didn't happen, so we can't report it wrongly. Anyway, now it's U.S. Congressman Bill Johnson from Ohio, Republican. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Congressman, just respond to what you've been hearing here from both attorneys and the argument we've had on this program.
Well, Chris, I think you've been making some of the very points that I would make. Ultimately, it's one person in this country that gets to make these decisions under our Constitution, and it's the President of the United States. And even the courts have affirmed that. In Harrisades versus Shaughnessy, the court ruled that no court, unless explicitly indicated in law, is to review the political branch of government's decision to allow or disallow aliens to come into the United States. So I think you've made the point very clear, Chris, and I've agreed with much of what you've said, that it's the president's responsibility to support and defend the United States. He has access to the classified information. It's his decision.
Well, my concern is I have to admit, it's policy, because in the end, the judges aren't going to make policy. They can criticize it, they can restrict it appropriately under the Constitution. But the dangerous thing we fall into here, and I haven't seen this happen before, there's going to be a question now of who's calling the shots in foreign policy and national security policy. It's on Trump's desk. You don't have to like him. You don't have to like the fact he won. You don't have to like anything. But we only have one president. They have to decide how to defend this country. And we start, hamstringing that ineffectively. Now, maybe inappropriately. Now, maybe you could argue that this is something that has to be stopped in its tracks, that this is so unconstitutional, we can't let it go any further. But I would think there's an argument that Trump has. He can say these countries have been selected out before as dangerous. We can't predict the country that hit us before will hit us again. Muhammad Ali came from Egypt. His hoods or his goons came from Saudi Arabia. Maybe you should go with, do you think it's more, I'll just throw it to you. Would it have made more sense for him to go over the countries that have hit us to start with rather than select another 7 to go after?
Well, I think you have to go back to what Judge Robart said.
Why didn't he name Egypt, for example? Why didn't he name Egypt?
Because he had the authority of the law.
But most of those guys came from Egypt. I mean,
because
Saudi Arabia.
Because he had the authority of the law on his side, Chris. The Senate Judiciary Committee conducted an analysis, and there have been over 500 people not only arrested but tried and convicted for terrorist acts in the United States. Over 380 of those people, Chris, were found to have been foreign-born, and 60 of those people arrested, tried, and convicted came from those 7 countries. So for Judge Robart or for anyone to say that there's no evidence that those countries aren't a threat, that's just simply inaccurate.
Okay, we'll have to go over all that. U.S. Congressman Bill Johnson of Ohio, thank you for coming on. By the way, we continue to cover the oral arguments tonight over President Trump's travel ban.